Late 1942. The Desert War in North Africa was ending, and for the first time since 1939, the Axis line was breaking. In Tunisia, American and British forces had cornered the Afrika Korps. The German generals, confident until the end, still scoffed at the newcomers. "The Americans have tanks," one officer sneered, "but they don't have the sea." When the last German columns surrendered in May 1943, the Allies stood on the shores of victory, staring across the Mediterranean at their next obstacle, Fortress Europe. The question haunting every planner in Eisenhower's headquarters was simple and terrifying. How do you bring tanks across an ocean and make them fight the moment they touch land? The Germans had faced that question before, at Dunkirk, where British tanks had drowned in the surf. They believed it was impossible, but in Washington and London, impossible was no longer a word anyone dared to use. The next step was Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, the largest amphibious invasion the world had yet seen. To the Allies, the island was the gateway to Europe. To the Germans, it was an anvil on which they would crush any invader. Between them lay 90 miles of open water and a coastline lined with guns. At Norfolk and Philadelphia, shipyards thundered night and day as new vessels took shape, flat-bottomed giants called landing ship tanks, or LSTs. They were crude, ugly, and revolutionary. Each one could carry 20, 30-ton Sherman tanks, drive them straight onto a beach, and withdraw before the tide swallowed its ramp. Yet no one knew if it would actually work in combat. Tanks were never meant to swim. Their armor was too heavy, their engines too fragile, their intakes too low. The engineers called the plan a gamble with steel. The infantry called it suicide. When early training films reached the Wehrmacht, German analysts laughed out loud. American swimming tanks, they wrote in a report to Berlin, let them drown themselves. But on the other side of the ocean, men like General George S. Patton saw something else, a weapon that could give the Allies what no army in history had possessed: instant armor on the beachhead. He pushed for every Sherman in his 2nd Armored Division to be trained for amphibious landing. "We will not just land, we will land fighting," he told his officers. The Sherman itself was a paradox, a tank built not to be the best, but to be everywhere. It was fast, reliable, and simple to repair. Its 75mm gun could take on enemy armor or blast a bunker. It had a range of 120 miles and could be mass-produced by the thousands. By late 1942, the M4 Sherman was rolling off American assembly lines at a rate that stunned even the Germans, nearly 2,000 a month. The Wehrmacht's engineers admitted privately that the Allies' true strength was not in one tank or one gun, but in the scale of their industry. Still, on the battlefield, German panzers like the Panzer IV and the Tiger I were superior in armor and firepower. The Sherman's thin hull could not withstand an 88mm hit. Its gasoline engine often turned hits into explosions. German tankers mockingly called it Tommy Cooker or Ronson, after the lighter that lights every time. Yet while the Tiger was a masterpiece of precision, it was also a prisoner of its own perfection, slow, complex, and few in number. The Sherman, by contrast, was a workhorse. It was built for endurance, not elegance. Now, engineers faced the task of making it do the unthinkable. At the Naval Engineering Experiment Station in Virginia, a team led by Lieutenant Andrew Higgins began testing modifications. They sealed engine vents with rubberized canvas, installed twin air intakes above the turret, and designed waterproof skirts that wrapped around the tracks. They tested the tanks in flooded ditches, lakes, and finally in the Atlantic surf. Most sank. The water pressure crushed gaskets, salt corroded fuel lines, and crews had to escape through hatches barely above the surface. The press never heard about those early failures. One Marine observer wrote in his report, "If these things can swim, pigs can fly." But every failure taught the Americans something the Germans did not know. Persistence was its own kind of weapon. By February 1943, the first test succeeded. The tanks could wade into 4 feet of surf and climb a 30-degree sand slope. "She swims," one engineer said in disbelief. Meanwhile, in North Africa, soldiers of the 2nd Armored Division practiced loading and unloading their Shermans from the new LSTs. The ship's massive bow doors opened like jaws, dropping steel ramps into the sea. Each tank driver had to judge the moment the ramp met the waves, rev the engine, and drive forward into the unknown. The first time they tried it, one driver hesitated, flooded his engine, and watched his tank sink in 20 seconds. The second time, he gunned it hard, splashing through chest-high water and roaring onto the sand. The beach erupted in cheers. For the first time, the U.S. Army had proven that a 30-ton tank could roll from ship to shore without a pier or port. The impossible had become possible. In Berlin, the German High Command received reports of strange American ships training off North Africa. Intelligence officers dismissed them as supply barges. Admiral Kesselring, in charge of Axis defenses in Italy, waved the files aside. They may have the sea, but they'll never bring their armor with them. He was wrong. In a few months, the same men who had crossed the Atlantic would cross an ocean of disbelief. As spring turned to summer, Operation Husky moved from paper to reality. The target? The southern coast of Sicily, near Gela. The plan called for an amphibious force larger than anything in history. Over 3,000 ships, 150,000 men, and hundreds of tanks. Among them, the Sherman would take its place not as a passenger, but as a pioneer. Its crews called themselves Seaborne Cavalry. One lieutenant wrote in his diary, "If this works, we'll be the first tanks in history to attack straight out of the sea. If it doesn't, well, at least the fish will have company." On July 9, 1943, as the invasion fleet gathered off the coast of Tunisia, sailors watched the horizon glow faintly from distant lightning. A storm was coming. The sea was restless, the wind rising. To the north lay the beaches of Sicily, and beyond them, the heart of the Axis. The men of the 2nd Armored Division tightened their gear, checked their radios, and stared at their machines, gleaming wet under the deck lights. No one knew what would happen when the ramps dropped, but one thing was certain. By dawn, the world would find out whether America's swimming tanks were a joke or a revolution.
The idea of driving a tank into the ocean and having it emerge from the surf like a steel sea creature sounded more like science fiction than strategy. Yet in early 1943, that was precisely what American engineers were trying to achieve. The M4 Sherman had already proven itself as the backbone of the Allied armored forces, fast, reliable, and endlessly adaptable. But turning it into an amphibious machine demanded a kind of madness that only war could inspire. At the Detroit Arsenal and the Aberdeen Proving Ground, teams of engineers worked around the clock, sketching designs that looked more like submarines than tanks. They knew the Sherman's greatest strengths, its durability and ease of production, could also become its weaknesses if it wasn't properly adapted. Water would find any gap, any seam, and kill both machine and crew in seconds. To make the Sherman amphibious, every vulnerability had to be sealed. Mechanics replaced vulnerable gaskets with new neoprene rubber, extended the exhaust system upward, and fitted massive snorkels to the engine intakes to keep air flowing even as the tank's hull was half submerged. The driver's hatch and periscope were modified with watertight clamps. Additional bilge pumps were installed to remove any water that might leak inside. Engineers even experimented with a collapsible canvas flotation screen, though in Sicily the design used was simpler. Shermans would be carried close to the shore in landing ship tank, LST vessels, then released to wade through the shallow surf on their own. The LST itself was one of the unsung miracles of the war. Conceived by British designers but perfected by American shipbuilders, it was a vessel both crude and ingenious. 328 feet long, flat-bottomed, and equipped with massive bow doors that could swing open to disgorge entire platoons of vehicles directly onto the beach. To the untrained eye, it looked awkward, almost laughable, a floating garage with a nose that could split open. But within those steel jaws lay the power to deliver mechanized warfare anywhere on Earth. The LST was the bridge between continents, and the Sherman was the fist that would cross it. Still, skepticism was everywhere. Among the Marines and Army infantry, rumors spread that the swimming Shermans would sink before reaching shore. A cynical sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division quipped, "If they wanted us to be sailors, they should have given us life jackets instead of tanks." During early trials along the coast of North Africa, the fears almost seemed justified. In one disastrous test, 3 tanks rolled down the ramp too soon, their tracks slipping on wet steel. 2 stalled before their exhaust cleared the waves, drowning their engines in seconds. The crews barely escaped as salt water rushed into the holes. Watching from the deck, one naval officer muttered, "Well, that's a new way to make an artificial reef." But others refused to laugh. The failures were data points, not defeats. Every misstep led to a new modification, a thicker seal, a stronger gasket. In Washington, General George C. Marshall and Admiral Ernest King kept the pressure on the Navy's Bureau of Ships. Time was running out. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was only months away. Every test had to succeed, or hundreds of lives would be lost in the first minutes of the landings. By April, success finally came. At a test site near Bizerte, Tunisia, an LST lowered its ramp into waist-deep surf. A Sherman, its hull freshly painted and engines roaring, rolled forward into the Mediterranean. The water rose up the glacis plate, foamed over the fenders, and then, miraculously, stopped. The tank pushed forward, leaving a frothy wake behind it. Within 30 seconds, it was climbing the sandbank. The crew popped the hatch, cheering. A British observer recorded the moment. "The damn thing swims!" But even as technical success arrived, strategic doubts remained. How would these tanks perform under fire? The M4 Sherman's advantages, speed, mobility, and easy maintenance, might mean little against coastal artillery and Luftwaffe dive bombers. And while its 75mm gun could handle bunkers and infantry, it was no match for the heavy armor of the German Tiger. Reports from Tunisia already told grim stories. Shermans destroyed by a single 88mm shell, their thin armor igniting like paper. American tankers called them Ronsons because, like the lighter, they lit every time. Commanders knew that if the Shermans got stuck on the beach or lost their waterproofing, they'd be nothing more than targets in the surf. Still, there was something else the Germans didn't understand, something no technical report could quantify. The Americans were learning faster. For every Tiger built, the U.S. could produce 20 Shermans. For every battle lost, they adjusted, refined, and rebuilt. The strength of the Sherman wasn't in its armor, it was in its adaptability, and in the crews who believed they could make the impossible work. By June 1943, training for Operation Husky was reaching its peak. Off the coast of Oran and Algiers, LSTs practiced coordinated landings day and night. Tank drivers rehearsed blind, guided only by hand signals and the sound of the surf. Engineers timed the moment between ramp drop and contact with the beach to the second. Sailors learned to secure tanks with cables during rough seas so they wouldn't crush each other as the ships rolled. It was a ballet of steel and timing, a choreography that combined shipbuilding, engineering, and courage. As the invasion drew near, commanders reviewed aerial reconnaissance of the Sicilian coast. The beaches near Gela were chosen for the American landings, a stretch of sand guarded by Italian artillery and German machine guns hidden in cliffs. The plan called for the 1st Infantry Division, backed by Shermans of the 2nd Armored Division, to storm the beaches at dawn. Patton's order was blunt. The tanks go in first. If they make it, the rest will follow. If they don't, God help the rest. On the evening of July 9th, the invasion fleet assembled off Tunisia. More than 3,000 ships stretched across the horizon. On the decks of the LSTs, Sherman crews checked their seals one last time, wiped condensation from their periscopes, and tightened the bolts around the snorkel vents. Some men taped photographs of their families inside the turrets. Others joked nervously about which shark would get the first bite. Then the order came over the loudspeakers. Prepared to lower ramps at dawn. Through the night, lightning flickered over the Mediterranean. Rain lashed the decks, and the sea rose in heavy swells. Many officers considered delaying the landing, but the operation was already in motion. By sunrise, the first Shermans would face the surf, the sand, and the guns of Gela. In the darkness before dawn, a mechanic aboard LST-313 leaned against his tank and whispered to his crewmate, "They called us fools for trying to make a tank swim." He smiled faintly. "Tomorrow, they'll call us something else." The morning of July 10, 1943,
broke gray and violent over the Sicilian coast. Lightning flashed beyond the horizon, and the sea, churned by a night of storms, was still restless when the invasion fleet appeared out of the mist. To the Italians and Germans stationed near the seaside town of Gela, it looked at first like a mirage, a vast armada stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. They counted hundreds of silhouettes, destroyers, transports, landing ships, and among them the strange, square-bowed LSTs that had never been seen before in combat. One Italian officer later wrote, "The sea itself seemed to move toward us. It was no longer water, it was war." At 0400 hours, the men aboard those LSTs were already awake. Inside the cavernous steel hulls, the tank decks rattled with the sound of engines coughing to life. The Shermans, chained in neat rows, gleamed under red battle lights. Diesel fumes hung in the air, mingling with the salt of the sea. Tank commanders climbed into their turrets, goggles fogged, hands slick with sweat. The night before, many had been seasick. Now, adrenaline drowned everything. Through the open doors of the landing ships, they could see flashes on shore, Italian coastal batteries firing blindly into the dark. On the bridge of the USS Monrovia, General George S. Patton stood watching through binoculars. The storm had scattered many of the paratroopers dropped inland, but he wasn't worried about that now. What mattered was the beach. If the tanks could get ashore and hold, the invasion would stand. If not, 150,000 men might be stranded under enemy fire. "The success of Husky," he muttered, "depends on steel." At 0430, the naval bombardment began. Allied cruisers and destroyers opened fire, their salvos lighting the clouds in orange flashes. The hills around Gela erupted in flame. The earth shook so hard that men on the landing ships thought they were being hit. Then came the order through the loudspeakers, "Lower the ramps." Hydraulic gears screamed as the massive bow doors swung open. Cold sea spray rushed in, soaking everything. The first tank, a Sherman of Company C, 2nd Armored Division, revved its Continental R975 radial engine and crept forward. Its driver, Sergeant John Red Harkins, could barely see through the spray. He gritted his teeth, gave the throttle full power, and drove straight into the surf. The tank dipped, water rising to the turret ring, waves crashing against the glacis plate, but the engine kept running. Inch by inch, it clawed forward, treads biting into sand hidden beneath the water. The LST crew watched in awe as the 30-ton machine rose out of the sea like a creature from myth. When the tank's nose broke the surface and climbed onto the beach, the sailors erupted in cheers. Behind it, more Shermans followed, 20 in all from that ship alone. Some stalled in deeper water, others made it ashore. On the beaches, infantry of the 1st Division huddled behind obstacles as machine gun fire stitched the sand around them. Italian gunners fired from concrete bunkers dug into the dunes, their 47mm shells pinging harmlessly off the Sherman's armor. One tank rotated its turret, fired a single 75mm shell, and turned the bunker into a plume of dust and smoke. For the first time in history, armored warfare had emerged from the sea. By 0700 hours, the beachhead at Gela was chaos. Landing craft smashed by waves drifted ashore, their hulls cracked open. Paratroopers staggered in from the countryside, soaked and disoriented. Yet amid the confusion, the Shermans began to form a line. They pushed inland, firing at anything that moved, machine gun nests, trucks, even telephone poles that might hide snipers. The tank's radios crackled with shouted coordinates from naval spotters offshore. Every few minutes, shells from battleships screamed overhead, landing with thunderous crashes on enemy strongpoints. From the hills above Gela, German and Italian observers watched in disbelief. At first, they assumed the Americans were landing small amphibious tractors like the ones used in the Pacific. But as the fog cleared, they saw the unmistakable shape of Sherman turrets, water dripping from their hulls. "Impossible," one German lieutenant whispered. "Tanks can't come from the sea." His commander snorted, then fell silent as another tank appeared behind the first, and then another. "Mein God, they're coming out of the water," he murmured.
By mid-morning, the Americans had secured the lower town of Gela. Sherman tanks rumbled through narrow streets, their tracks grinding over cobblestones. Italian soldiers waved white flags from windows, while others fought from rooftops. In one dramatic moment, a Sherman crew fired point-blank into a church bell tower being used as an observation post, sending stone and brass cascading into the square. Civilians hid in cellars, trembling as the tanks passed overhead. But victory on the beach was far from secure. From the north, German reinforcements were already on the move. The Hermann-Göring Panzer Division, stationed near Nesemi, began rolling south. Their orders were clear: drive the Americans back into the sea. Leading the counterattack were Panzer IVs and Tiger Is, machines the Americans both feared and respected. When news of the German movement reached Patton's headquarters, he sent a terse radio message to the beach: hold at all costs, reinforcements on the way. That afternoon, the tanks of the 2nd Armored dug in behind dunes, forming a makeshift defensive line. Engineers worked frantically to unload more Shermans from the LSTs under artillery fire. Waves slammed the ramps, tossing vehicles like toys, but the crews kept going. By sunset, over 90 Shermans were ashore. They were scratched, soaked, and battered, but alive. Private William Baxter of the 1st Division later recalled the moment he saw the tanks crest the ridge behind Gela. They looked like wet dogs shaking off the sea. I'd never been so glad to see a tank in my life. The infantry followed close behind, advancing under the cover of those steel beasts. Together, they pushed the Axis defenders inland, yard by yard, bunker by bunker. By nightfall, the Americans held a 10-mile beachhead. Fires burned all along the coast. The sea was red with reflections of flares and tracer rounds. Exhausted tank crews leaned against their hulls, the metal still warm from battle. They had done the impossible, brought tanks ashore under fire, through storm and surf, and lived to fight another day. Up in the hills, a German major named Karl Richter filed a report to headquarters. His words were brief and stunned. The enemy has developed an amphibious tank landing capability. Their armor moves directly from ship to shore. This changes everything. It did. That night, as the surviving Axis forces regrouped for a counterattack, the American flag waved above the port of Gela. The men who had ridden their swimming coffins from sea to sand looked out over the dark water and realized they had made history. They had not only survived the sea, they had conquered it.
The dawn of July 11 came with a deceptive calm. The surf had quieted, the skies had cleared, and the men of the 1st Infantry Division were finally beginning to believe the worst was over. Around them, the beaches of Gela were a wreck of twisted steel, burned-out landing craft, half-sunken trucks, and the carcasses of tanks that had drowned before reaching shore. But behind the dunes, the survivors of the 2nd Armored Division were cleaning the sand from their gun barrels and checking fuel lines. Their tanks had lived through the sea. Now they would have to survive the counterattack. It came at 0800. From the northern hills beyond the Akate River, dust clouds began to rise, long, thick trails that shimmered in the morning heat. At first, the Americans thought they were reinforcements. Then binoculars revealed the unmistakable silhouettes: German tanks, dozens of them advancing in formation. The counterattack had begun. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the elite Hermann-Göring Panzer Division were driving south, determined to hurl the invaders back into the sea. At their spearhead rolled the dreaded Tiger I, its massive 88mm gun already loaded. On the beaches, Tank Commander Lieutenant Chuck Turner of Company A squinted toward the hills and saw flashes of sunlight glinting off armor. "Here they come," he muttered. His gunner, Sergeant Weiss, locked the 75mm into position. The rangefinder ticked upward. 2,000 yards, 1,800, 1,500. Fire! The first round screamed downrange and exploded in a puff of dirt just short of the lead Panzer IV. Then the Germans returned fire. A shell slammed into the sand 20 feet away, throwing up a geyser that rattled the tank like an earthquake. For the next 6 hours, the beaches of Gela became an inferno. Sherman after Sherman opened fire,
their 75mm guns booming in unison. The Germans responded with 88s, the same weapons that had devastated Allied armor in North Africa. A direct hit from one of those guns could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor like paper, igniting its fuel tanks. Several tanks burst into flame, crews scrambling out into the open before secondary explosions tore them apart. The air stank of burning gasoline and salt. But the Americans had two advantages the Germans hadn't expected: mobility and coordination. The Shermans, though lighter and less protected, could turn and reposition faster than the Tigers. They worked in teams, using the dunes and wrecked landing craft as cover. One tank would draw the Germans' fire, while another flanked their position, firing into their weaker side armor. Naval gunfire from offshore destroyers joined in, pounding German columns moving along the roads. The destroyer USS Shubrick fired so close to the American lines that the men could see the shells streaking overhead like glowing hammers. At 9:30, the German counterattack reached the edge of Gela town. Infantry with Panzerfausts crept through vineyards firing at the advancing Shermans. Some tanks went up in flames, but most held their ground. Major General Terry Allen, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, radioed the fleet. Request immediate naval fire on coordinates 38 degrees N, 14 degrees east. Enemy tanks in open. Minutes later, the cruiser USS Boys unleashed a storm of 6-inch shells that ripped through the German ranks. One round landed directly on a Panzer IV, flipping it on its side like a toy. Despite the bombardment, the Germans pressed on. A group of Tigers managed to reach the outskirts of Gela, where they began firing into the harbor. Patton, pacing aboard the USS Monrovia, received word that his beachhead was in danger of collapse. He turned to his staff and barked, "Tell the Navy to shell the hell out of them." Moments later, every ship within range joined the fight. The roar of naval guns drowned out everything. The ground shook. The sea boiled with concussion waves. At 1100, a formation of American P-40 Warhawks from the 33rd Fighter Group appeared overhead, diving out of the sun. They strafed the German columns, their .50 caliber bullets ripping through soft-skin vehicles and fuel trucks. Smoke rose in thick columns, drifting over the battlefield like storm clouds. In the chaos, one Sherman commander, Captain William Darby, who would later lead the famous Darby Rangers, spotted a Tiger breaking through a hedgerow at close range. The German behemoth fired, missing by inches. Darby's gunner, calm under pressure, aimed for the Tiger's side armor and fired twice in rapid succession. The second shot penetrated the fuel tank, igniting a fire that turned the heavy tank into a rolling furnace. "That's for Kasserine," Darby shouted over the radio, referencing the battle where American armor had been humiliated months earlier. By midday, the counterattack began to falter. The German columns, cut off by naval fire and strafing runs, started pulling back toward the hills. Patton's tanks pursued them, guns blazing. What had begun as an attempt to drive the Americans into the sea had become a desperate retreat. The beach at Gela was now secure, but at a terrible cost. The 2nd Armored Division had lost over 24 tanks, and hundreds of men lay dead or wounded among the dunes. When the smoke cleared that evening, Patton came ashore. Dressed in khakis and polished boots, he walked among the wreckage, burned tanks, craters, shattered landing craft, and nodded grimly. They said it couldn't be done. Well, by God, we did it. He knelt beside a Sherman still smoldering from a hit and placed his gloved hand on its armor. "You boys swam, and you fought, and you didn't sink." From the cliffs above, German officers watched through field glasses as more LSTs arrived offshore, unloading without pause. The sight broke their spirit. "The sea itself is their ally," one of them remarked. By nightfall, the once invincible Axis grip on Sicily had begun to unravel. The Americans had established a permanent foothold, and their swimming tanks had proven that there was no longer a frontier, neither land nor sea, that they couldn't cross. The next morning, when German intelligence transmitted its after-action report to Berlin, it carried a single line that summed up the disaster. "The enemy has achieved the impossible. They have made the ocean their road. And that road, paved with steel, courage, and sacrifice,
would soon lead all the way to mainland Europe.
Once the beaches of Gela were secured, the true test of the American war machine began. Sicily was no longer just a beachhead, it was a proving ground. From the coastal sands to the mountain roads, the Shermans that had clawed their way out of the surf now faced the brutal terrain and tactical cunning of a retreating enemy that refused to die quietly. General Patton, his confidence unshaken after the defense of Gela, looked inland toward the hills and vineyards of Sicily and saw opportunity. "We didn't come here to dig foxholes," he said. "We came here to roll." The next phase of Operation Husky was a race, one that pitted Patton's 7th Army against not only the German and Italian defenders, but also the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery, advancing from the southeast. The Allies were converging on Palermo and Messina, hoping to trap Axis forces before they could evacuate to the Italian mainland. The Americans would strike west and north, crossing mountains, rivers, and valleys under constant fire. And leading the way, as always, were the Shermans. The tanks that had swum ashore at Gela were now being used in the kind of warfare they were born for: maneuver, aggression, and flexibility. Engineers converted roads overnight, laying steel mesh over mud and building bridges from wrecked vehicles. Each morning, the columns rumbled forward, engines roaring, treads grinding stone into dust. Sicilian villagers watched from olive groves, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. For them, war had always come from above: bombers, artillery, death from the sky. Now it moved on tracks. In the narrow mountain passes near Noto and Canicattì, the Shermans met their next great enemy: the terrain. The winding roads were barely wide enough for a single tank, and the Germans had left behind minefields, ambushes, and sniper nests. On July 15, near Favara, an entire platoon was pinned down by 88mm guns hidden behind stone walls. Every attempt to move forward brought another explosion. The solution came not from the officers, but from the tankers themselves. Sergeant Bill Anderson, remembering what had worked in Tunisia, ordered his driver to ram through a farmhouse wall, using it as cover. From there, his crew blasted the German position from point-blank range. When the dust settled, the road was open. "The Sherman was never perfect, but it always gave us a chance," he later said. That chance was all Patton needed. Over the next 2 weeks, the 7th Army advanced faster than anyone expected. Every night, the Shermans were refueled, rearmed, and patched up by their crews. Mechanics worked by flashlight, welding armor plates and rethreading tracks. They joked that their tanks had more patchwork than the Liberty ships offshore. Yet no matter how battered, they kept moving. The tankers slept on the hulls, ate from ration tins balanced on gun barrels, and painted victory marks on their turrets. German resistance was fierce. The Harman-Göring Division, humiliated at Gela, fought a skilled delaying action. In the hill town of Enna, they used the terrain to their advantage, setting ambushes at every hairpin turn. Shermans fought their way through streets so narrow they had to drive through houses just to maneuver. Local civilians hiding in cellars would later recall the walls trembling as tanks fired point-blank at German strongpoints. "It was like thunder that did not end," one Sicilian farmer told an Allied reporter after the war. On July 22nd, the Shermans reached Palermo, the jewel of western Sicily. The city's defenders, worn out and demoralized, surrendered without a fight. Patton rode into the square in a command car, cigar clenched between his teeth as crowds of civilians cheered. Behind him came the tanks, their hulls scarred by shrapnel, their tracks leaving black marks on the cobblestones. Reporters captured the moment in photographs that would appear in newspapers across the world: the American general and his amphibious armor rolling triumphantly through a liberated city. But the victory was not just symbolic. Palermo's harbor opened a new supply line for the Allied advance. The success of the Shermans on land, combined with the LSTs at sea, proved the Allies could now project power across any barrier: water, mountain, or fortified line. The message to the Axis was clear: there was no safe coast left in Europe. Still, the campaign was not without cost. The terrain, heat, and endless ambushes wore down both men and machines. By the time the Americans reached Messina in mid-August, many Shermans bore the scars of a dozen battles: patched armor, missing fenders, melted tracks. Mechanics called them Frankenstein tanks, and yet they kept fighting. When the final Axis troops evacuated across the Strait of Messina under cover of night, it wasn't because they had been outgunned, it was because they had been outlasted. Patton's after-action report summed up the secret of the Shermans' success in Sicily with a single sentence: "It is not the tank's armor or gun that wins battles, it is the men inside and their will to drive forward." The men of the 2nd Armored Division, the Hell on Wheels, had proven that will beyond question. They had fought from the sea to the mountains, against both the elements and the enemy, and turned what began as a desperate gamble into a campaign of mastery. When the last Sherman rolled into Messina on August 17th, Patton climbed onto its hull, saluted the crew, and looked across the narrow water toward Italy. "Gentlemen, we've taught the bastards to swim. Now let's teach them how to drown," he said with a grin. The soldiers laughed, but they knew it wasn't bravado. The next invasion, mainland Italy, was already being planned. And the Shermans, those same swimming coffins mocked by the Germans at Gela, would lead the way again. That night, as the fires of Sicily faded behind them, a tank driver named Harkins wrote in his diary, "They said our tanks would sink, they said we'd never make it past the beach. But we rolled out of the sea and into history."